cell phone, if you would please turn it off or turn it to silent. Okay, if I can get everybody to stand for the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America, for which it stands, one nation, under God, and indivisible, for liberty and justice for all. Okay, good evening. I'm John Butler, your president for the Civil War Roundtable here in Brunswick County. Would all the new people stand up? If you're a guest or a new member, would you please stand up? Chris, you got a good turnout tonight for new people. Okay, my next slide. Unfortunately, I have some bad news I have to pass along. Our treasurer has passed away, Gary Krupp. Gary was a member of the Civil War Roundtable for over 10 years. He's been our treasurer for several years. I depended upon Gary tremendously. Great person. One of the facts you may not know about Gary, how dependable Gary was. If you'll all recall back in January, when our speaker up there in Virginia, because of the storm, said, "Oh, it's snowing. I can't come down." Well, guess where Gary was? Gary was in Harrisburg, PA, same day, watching his son being inaugurated into his first public office job, before he jumped into the car with Chris and he said to Chris, "I have to get to the round table. They need me." They drove like crazy, Chris told me, and they got here in time to get to the bank, to get the money, to get everybody ready, and he was here on time. I don't know what you can call, but Gary was just dependable. Great guy. He'll be sorely missed. Next slide. John Walsh.
Okay, as you see on the slide, we are once again, or twice again this time, doing tours of Fort Caswell, which is quite a ways from here, about 60 feet, right over on the side. A very, very historic fort. Those of you who were at our December meeting, you saw Jim McKee give the history of Fort Caswell. He is the guy who knows it better than anyone else. He will be once again leading our tours. Now, this is the 5th or 6th time we've done it. I mean, it gets rave reviews every time. You may have seen the announcement in the March newsletter, Call to Arms, which if you don't read it, you got to read it. It's terrific. Gifford Stack does a great job on it. The tour starts at 5 p.m. We're going to do it just prior to our April meeting and again just prior to our May meeting. We have a little bit of availability for the April meeting, quite a bit for the May meeting right now. I'll be up here again after the meeting if you'd like to sign up, or send me an email and we'll do it. And rest in peace, Gary Krupp, great guy. Thank you.
Next slide. Okay, we tried something different tonight. Joe, would you stand up? Joe called me on the phone and said, "Hey, why don't we try to do something around memorabilia? I collected and maybe some people are interested." So Joe has a table there of some memorabilia. If you're interested, we might start this as a normal event in all our meetings. Go talk to Joe. Might be of interest to some of you. You guys can do your trading, talk about that, but could be an interesting addition to the meetings in the future. Joe, great idea. Thank you. Next slide. Park Day. Any of you interested? Fort Fisher is participating in Park Day. It's put on for all the big national military parks. Fort Fisher is one of them in the local area participating. You just call Becky over there, say, I want to participate. You show up on the 9th of April, go do whatever kind of jobs they want you to do, raking, painting, any kind of that kind of stuff. You don't need to do anything except just show up. So if you want something to do on Saturday, that could be an interesting little thing to do. All right, next slide. 50-50. Next slide, please. How much money? 23. Ah, good number. All right. 50-50 for $123. That's a good amount of money this time. Number is 124417. 417 is the last three. Any takers? 124417. All right, check that man's number. I don't trust him. All right, for a free book in the Sutler's Table, 124598. 124598. All right. Hey, Ann, did you see this guy for the Sutler's Table? Okay. No, the Sutler's Table. See the lady over there with her hand up? All right. Now, on with the show. Next slide. Gar will introduce our speaker for tonight, Chris Fonvielle. Gar, all yours.
Good evening. Tonight, we have speaking for us the current record holder for the largest attendance, Chris Fonvielle. And we have a good threat for the best attendance since we've come back after the pandemic. So you may have two of these, Chris. There is one thing that's not noted up on the bio of Mr. Fonvielle, and that is that playing football at New Hanover High in Wilmington, he was the first football player in the state of North Carolina to be a soccer-style kicker. It's important. You need to add that back up, Chris. Now, Chris did get his... Chris did get his PhD at University of South Carolina. To get there, though, was a little bit of an adventure. He had to come down and interview with Dr. Tom Connolly. Pass that interview, and you've got a good shot to get in. Well, he asked, how do I make sure that this goes well? They told him, on the way down to South Carolina, stop at an ABC store and buy a bottle of the best bourbon you can find. Being smart, he stopped at an ABC store and bought the best bottle of bourbon he could find, took it to the interview. They chatted a little bit, drank a little bourbon, chatted a little more, drank some more. By the end of the interview, Dr. Connolly looked at him and says, okay, when you come back down, bring another bottle of this because you're in. All right, to speak to us tonight on Closing Down the Kingdom, the Wilmington Campaign, Chris Fonvielle.
stories, true stories. I think I've got 598 was the attendance record. And Bud Robertson, the great historian from Virginia, spoke right after I did, and he got 597. And I told him, I said, I've still got the record. He said, well, but you're a local guy. Of course you got the record. It's great to be back with y'all. I am, okay, I'm depending on the sound people in the back. Are we okay now? Can you hear me okay? Yeah, who's got the bourbon? How's that? Closer? How's that? Is that good? Okay, all right. All right, it's always great to be with y'all. I was one of the early speakers, but I was thinking earlier tonight, I haven't spoken here in 4 years when I set the attendance record. So it's great to be back. Of course, the last 2 years were just kind of throwaway years. And I'm here to talk to y'all about the Wilmington Campaign, which I've spent much of my life studying and writing about. So much so that one night Nancy and I were in bed, and I must have had this pensive look on my face, and she asked me what I was thinking about, and I said, Fort Fisher. Wrong thing to say when you're in that situation. But, okay, well, I'm sorry. I'm totally dependent on them up there. All right, we'll do that. Hang on. Okay, how's that? Can you hear me now? Okay, good. Sorry about that. Please stand by technical difficulties. John told me earlier, he said, you know what I would do if I was talking on the Wilmington Campaign tonight, since the president's getting ready to do the State of the Union, tell everybody that the State of the Union was not good before the Wilmington Campaign, but it was very good after the Wilmington Campaign. That's all you need to know. Okay. Let's see. Go to the next slide. It's just not going to do it for me. Okay, there. Wilmington was the largest city in North Carolina on the eve of the Civil War, and increasingly will become important as a seaport for receiving goods that were smuggled in through the Union naval blockade to sustain the South's war effort. By 1863, it was the South's most important seaport, and I argue that by late 1864, it was the most important city in the Confederacy. Now, Virginians, of course, will argue against me on that one, but we North Carolinians like to say, well, we live in the valley of humility surrounded by two mountains of conceit, Virginia and South Carolina. So I'm telling y'all the true story tonight. Next slide, please. I don't know why this is not going to work. So shortly after the war began, President Abraham Lincoln proclaimed a naval blockade against the southern states, knowing full well that this region of farmers, planters, and slaves was going to depend on the European market for war material and civilian goods if it was to fight a war. Next slide. And I don't know why I can't do this. So the idea was that there'd be a concentrated dragnet of Union warships at the entryway to southern harborways, and there were about a dozen major southern seaports, and you would know them: Norfolk, Virginia; New Bern, Wilmington, North Carolina; Charleston, Georgetown, South Carolina; Savannah, Pensacola, Florida; New Orleans, Galveston, Texas. So that's where the Navy Department focused its efforts. But keep in mind now, there's no Joint Chiefs, right? So the Navy Department is acting independently of the War Department, and it is the Lincoln administration that is trying to coordinate the efforts of both. So combined operations, or what we would call joint operations today, really just had not taken full effect yet. Next slide. So the South's response to the naval blockade was blockade running. That is, sailing vessels and then steam-propelled vessels would be used to smuggle supplies in from Europe through neutral transshipment points like Bermuda, next slide, Nassau, Cuba, and Wilmington, of course, became an important seaport because it was close to the Virginia battlefront. Next slide. Now, New Orleans and other important points fell early. New Orleans, of course, was at the mouth of the father of all waters. It controlled the Mississippi River, and the strategy was to effectively blockade the southern seaports, capture the Mississippi River, and then strike inland against strategic targets. So that was the strategy in the spring of '61. And by early '62, New Orleans had been captured by Union Army and naval forces. Next slide, please. And by that same spring, Union and Army forces had captured and now occupied North Carolina's Outer Banks, Albemarle and Pamlico Sounds, the Roanoke River, the Neuse River, the Pamlico River, the river towns and cities. They controlled everything from Norfolk, which they recaptured in May of '62, to White Oak Swamp, only 60 miles north of Wilmington. So if the strategy was to knock off each southern seaport like a game of dominoes, Wilmington should have been the next target. Next slide, please. But instead, the Union hopscotched over Wilmington and went after Charleston instead, because that's where political and public interest centered. That's where the war had begun. That was the nest of the secessionists. And so blockade runners that operated at Charleston transferred their operations 175 miles up the coast to Wilmington, and that benefited the Confederacy extremely well. Next slide, please. The success rate for blockade runners at Wilmington was 80%, and it was literally a cat and mouse game, as Union blockaders offshore had to deal with dual inlets. That is, these ships could smuggle supplies in through Old Inlet at the mouth of the river, only miles from where we sit tonight, and 6 miles to the northeast, y'all can see this, let me get the pointer, is New Inlet, formed by Hurricane 1761. So that's 6 miles apart on the inside of the harbor, but separated by Bald Head Island and Frying Pan Shoals. The distance between the two inlets was about 40 miles for the Union blockaders. So virtually impossible to blockade. And the mouse won 80% of the time. One Union naval officer said that we were like a parcel of cats watching a rat hole that had 2 ways in and out, and you never knew which hole the rat was going to use. And most times, the rat or the mouse won the game. Okay, next slide. So goods brought in on board these ships would make the trek 28 miles upriver to Wilmington, 9 miles to the coast. So Wilmington, unlike Charleston, was out of range for Union naval bombardment. To close the harbor to blockade running, the city would have to be captured, or the forts at the mouth of the river be captured. Okay, next slide. And of course, what they brought in for government account were firearms and artillery and ammunition, but they also brought in civilian goods because, of course, there's no successful war effort unless you have public support. Those of us of the Vietnam War era know that. to be the case. We didn't lose the Vietnam War in Southeast Asia. We lost it because it lost political and public support. Okay, next slide. Now, Wilmington had good lines of transportation, railroads, and the Cape Fear River for sending supplies and reinforcements to the front, either to the battlefront or to the home front. That's why Southport did not become a blockade-running seaport. It did not have lines of transportation or communication. There were no railroads or major roads coming and going at what was then Smithville. These ships had to go all the way up to Wilmington, where they traded literally guns for cotton for export, because the European nations wanted high-quality Southern cotton in exchange for the clandestine trade of smuggling goods through the naval blockade. So the Wilmington to Weldon Railroad became the most important line. It ran from Wilmington to Goldsboro, Goldsboro to Weldon, North Carolina, where it connected with the Petersburg and Weldon, which became so important to General Lee as a route or artery of supplies. By 1863, it became known as Lee's Lifeline, and by 1864, it became known as the Lifeline of the Confederacy. Next slide, please. So, to defend Wilmington, to defend the inlets, which you've seen, to defend the ships that were bringing in these vital supplies, the Confederate government invested a lot of energy and resources and manpower to construct defenses. Next slide. In fact, other than Charleston, Wilmington was the most heavily fortified city along the Atlantic seaboard. You had forts like Fort Anderson, just 10 miles above us, where we're going to do a tour in October, I'm reminded. We did Sugarloaf recently. We're going to do Fort Anderson here soon. Okay, next slide. Fort Fisher was the main guardian, and it protected New Inlet for ships that came out of Bermuda particularly. Nassau as well. These are British neutral transshipment points. But Fort Fisher, next, it was at the end of New Hanover County. From a bird's eye view, it looked like a big giant number 7 with a northern front that guarded the ground across which enemy forces might attack. And then this land front, or the seafront right here, that had artillery batteries that could provide covering fire for the blockade runners that are coming and going, even though they're operating at nighttime anyway, for the most part. Unless you're running short on fuel or get into trouble, you're running in the middle of the night, and the darker the better. Okay, next slide. So this was a massive fortification made of earth, because brick and mortar forts like Fort Caswell were worthless because of the technology, the artillery at the time. In fact, even at Fort Caswell, as Jim McKee will tell y'all, the Confederates built a sand fort around the old brick and mortar fort, which was worthless by 1862, okay? So massive fortification at Fort Fisher. Next slide, please. Well armed with big seacoast guns, they're called, cannons that were capable of firing shells at great distances, 2 to 3 miles, like this Armstrong rifled cannon that was imported through the blockade. It came mounted on a rosewood and mahogany carriage with brass fittings, and that's a trophy of war that the United States Army got. And where is it today? The Military Academy at West Point, New York. That's one of the few surviving Fort Fisher guns. Next slide, please. Commanded by Colonel William Lamb, but under the overall command and supervision of General Chase Whiting, WHC Whiting, class of 1845, United States Military Academy, highest grades of any cadet until Douglas MacArthur graduated in 1906. So this was a brilliant man who was sent to Wilmington to help build a vast network of fortifications to protect this increasingly vital trade for the Confederacy. Next, please. Now, by 1864, Wilmington was so important that Robert E. Lee said, if the city falls, I cannot maintain my army. So Lee's Lifeline, the Wilmington-Weldon Railroad, bringing in all those supplies, firearms and uniforms and foodstuffs, was literally keeping his army alive, and particularly as the Confederacy got carved up more and more, and so much more of the fighting was concentrated in Virginia after U.S. Grant took control of the armies in the spring of 1864. And he was determined to destroy Lee's army, not as his predecessors had done, capture strategic targets. They were important, but he wanted to destroy Lee's capability to defend those strategic targets. Next. Well, the Navy Department knew how important Wilmington was as well. Gideon Welles, early in the war, had hopscotched over Wilmington to go after Charleston because, as he said, may as well go by Wilmington and attack Charleston where public and political interest centered, because Charleston is Satan's kingdom. But for the Confederacy, Wilmington became, well, God's kingdom for the Confederacy. So it was important to close down that kingdom too. And Gideon Welles freely admitted, to close the port of Wilmington is undoubtedly the most important and effective demonstration that can be made. If of less prestige than the capture of Richmond, it would be damaging to the rebels, and according to Lee, even more so, okay? Well, things changed by the summer of 1864. There had been proposals to capture Wilmington in 62 and 63 that did not come to fruition. Remember, very little cooperation between the Navy Department and the War Department. The War Department was determined to capture Richmond, and then Vicksburg, and then Atlanta. And blockade runners continued to operate at Wilmington. The last seaport on the Gulf Coast to be closed to blockade running was Mobile Bay. Admiral David Farragut, and you know the story, told that the Confederates had mined the harbor way with torpedoes. He allegedly said, "Damn the torpedoes, full steam ahead." Yeah, I think he said, "Damn, torpedoes." Well, go ahead. But we like the Davy Crockett version of that. So now, next slide, Mobile has been closed. That left only Wilmington open to trade with the outside world. And Gideon Welles rushed to the White House and sought permission from Lincoln to attack Wilmington. Lincoln, who had been indifferent to Wilmington's fate for more than 2 years, recognized a good thing when he saw it. He had predicted in July that if the war continued as it was, he would not be reelected in November. In fact, he predicted that he would be defeated by his arch rival, George McClellan, who he had fired not once but twice as commander of the Army of the Potomac. And if McClellan became president, he would also assert himself as commander of the United States Army Forces. And guess who would be out of a job? Not just the president, but Grant. So Lincoln gave approval of a plan for an attack on Wilmington after 2.5 years of paying it, as we say in the South, no never mind whatsoever. Next slide. But he wanted U.S. Grant give it the go-ahead. He had complete faith in Grant, as you know. Grant, now fighting a war of attrition and stalemate against Lee's forces at Petersburg, was not interested in Wilmington. He, like Lincoln for 2.5 years, was indifferent to an attack, but recognizing Lincoln's political dilemma and his own dilemma, should Lincoln not be reelected, agreed to supply an expeditionary force when the time was right. Well, next slide. Given the tacit approval, the Navy Department assigns David Dixon Porter to command the North Atlantic Blockading Squadron. He assembled the largest fleet of the Civil War, 150 vessels, from which he chose 64 to attack the defenses at the entryway to the Cape Fear Harbor and stop blockade running. And this is a guy that you want by your side in a barroom brawl. He was tough as hide leather, but also, like a previous president of ours, very vain and narcissistic and egotistical. Regardless of what you think about his policies, you know what I'm talking about. It's the me, 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 me. That was David Porter. But like Muhammad Ali, he could float like a butterfly, but he could sting like a bee too. Okay, next slide. Now, the Army, under Grant, assigned Godfrey Weitzel, the former commander of the chief of the Army of the Army of the Potomac, to take command of the expeditionary force, but his commanding officer, Benjamin Butler, very controversial, assumed command, much to Grant's chagrin and Porter's disgust. Next slide. In large part because, next slide, Porter and Benjamin Butler disliked each other intently. In fact, in his post-war memoir, Benjamin Butler wrote, "David Porter hated me like the devil hated holy water." And here the two major service branch commanders are supposed to cooperate to close Wilmington to blockade running, and they hate each other. They cannot stand each other. So there's not going to be a great deal of cooperation. Next slide. There was also politics of command on the Confederate side. Chase Whiting, who had done so much to build the fortifications at Wilmington, was replaced by Braxton Bragg at the 11th hour. Now here's the most important seaport, the most important city in the Confederacy, and Jefferson Davis sends the most hated general officer to take over command at Wilmington. Now, does that make sense? It didn't make sense to the Virginia media, next slide, who wrote, "Braxton Bragg has been sent to Wilmington. Goodbye, Wilmington." No one had faith in Braxton Bragg except Jefferson Davis, and it was said that Jefferson Davis never forgot a friend and never forgave an enemy, and to him, Whiting was in that anti-Davis camp like Joseph Johnston and P.G.T. Beauregard, and he had to be replaced. And the joke during the war was that Braxton Bragg was the best Confederate general the Union Army had. And now, not only does he have a fortification named for him in Fayetteville, but he has been sent to Wilmington at the 11th hour for the Confederacy. It does not bode well. Next slide. So the campaign finally gets underway in mid-December. It takes time to organize these things. And next slide. The attack would begin on Christmas Eve, ironically enough, and for 2 days, the United States Navy, under Porter, 64 warships, would unleash the largest naval bombardment of the Civil War to soften up the defenses so that the expeditionary force could go ashore and capture the fort. Next slide, please. Now, I could go into 100 different human interest stories, but rather than just throw a bunch of names and statistics at you, I do want to concentrate on one. And by the way, the Confederates, low on ammunition and gunpowder, responded as best they could to let the Navy know that they were still there. But a great story. Next slide, what the Federal warships were doing is concentrating their fire on the most visible targets inside the fort. From their vantage point, a mile to a mile and a half offshore, the earthen fortifications look like, one sailor said, bales of hay. But what they could see were the flags flying defiantly over the fort. And so they focused on the flags to establish their effective range of fire. And the Confederates recognized that and moved all of the flags to the far backside of the fort near the Cape Fear River. And Colonel Lamb later wrote in his post-war memoir, the Federal fleet fired at least 1/3 of their ammunition at my fort that went over the fort and into the Cape Fear River in the rear. It was the biggest waste of gunpowder in the annals of warfare. But at the very end of that sea face, there was a 43-foot-high mound battery that had plunging fire towards New Inlet in case any of the warships attempted to blast their way past the lower batteries, as David Damn the Torpedoes Farragut had done at Mobile Bay. Colonel Lamb sent word down to the mound battery that he wanted a flag to be flown over that battery in defiance. The flag pole did not have halyards, so it was going to require someone to shinny up the pole. And a young soldier from Pitt County named Christopher Kit Bland volunteered, and with a Confederate flag between his teeth or under his arms, I don't know how he did it, he shinnied up that flagpole. And the Union warships on the south end of the battle line saw him and did everything that they could to knock him off, firing their guns at him. Zoom, zoom, boom, boom. Calmly, coolly, deliberately put the flag up, came back down to the floor of the battery, only to look up to see that the flag had been knocked away, one end of it. So he had to reclimb the flagpole to reattach it. Under heavy fire from the Union gunboats offshore, successful again in his deed, he came back down to the bottom of the battery, to the cheers of his comrades and to the cheers of the Union sailors and Marines on board those ships who said, now there's a man's man. We couldn't get him, but we have to acknowledge, man, that is a courageous guy. That flag was given to Governor Zebulon Vance at the end of the battle as a trophy of the Confederate victory because the Confederacy won that war. Next, or won that battle. Next slide, please. Union forces did go ashore, but the fire of the fleet had been so ineffective because they'd focused on those flags that General Weitzel, General Butler remained on board one of the ships offshore to be safe and secure. Weitzel led the reconnaissance in force and determined that this is going to be a murderous affair like the attack by the 54th Massachusetts at Battery Wagner, the subject of the movie Glory. And so the Army aborted the mission, next slide, and returned home. Much to the disgust of Admiral Porter and to General Grant. And of course, Porter blamed Butler. Butler blamed Porter for the unsuccessful attack. And then the election now over, Lincoln felt comfortable to give Grant the authority to fire Butler, and he went home to Massachusetts. But at the same time, next slide, that the Federals failed to capture Fort Fisher, there was a concurrent Union victory to the south. In the meantime, Braxton Bragg was given credit for the victory at Fort Fisher, and he had nothing to do with it. The Wilmingtonians gave him a brand new uniform, and he withdrew reinforcements that General Lee had sent to the area to make sure that Wilmington remained in safe hands up to Wilmington. While Lamb and Whiting, next slide please, were absolutely convinced that the Federals would return sooner than later. Next slide please. They were sure that the Federals would return quickly. Next slide please. Now, 300 miles to the south, William T. Sherman captured Savannah, Georgia, presented the city to President Lincoln as a gift for Christmas. And Grant, glad to see Sherman safe on the seacoast, was going to transfer his 60,000-man legion that had destroyed Atlanta and then marched all the way across Georgia, destroying everything in his path like an army of army ants. Now he was going to transfer that army by sea to Virginia for one final push against Lee's strongly entrenched forces. But having successfully made that march to the sea, Sherman proposed instead to march to Virginia by way of the Carolinas and do exactly what he had done so successfully in Georgia: destroy railroads, depots, supply caches, infrastructure, plantations, whatever it took to erode public support for the war effort. That's how you win wars. So Grant, next slide please, later said he would have entrusted this movement, known as the Carolinas Campaign today, but he called it the Northern Expedition. Next slide, please. And he said, I would not have entrusted that movement to any other general officer but William T. Sherman. So begin the Northern Expedition. But to make sure the expedition was successful, Grant wanted to provide Sherman a haven on the seacoast halfway between Savannah and Petersburg where Sherman could retreat if he got into trouble, or from where Grant could send reinforcements and supplies if Sherman could make it to the North Carolina-South Carolina line. And Sherman's target was Fayetteville and then Goldsboro. And once he got Goldsboro, they would cut the Wilmington-Weldon Railroad. From there, he could go west to attack Raleigh, south to go after Wilmington, or better yet, go up the Wilmington-Weldon Railroad to hit the underbelly of Lee's force at Petersburg, while Grant continued to press him from the east. So Grant, indifferent to the first attack on Fort Fisher, now becomes very interested, and his objective is Wilmington. To use the railroads, to use the river, navigable all the way to Fayetteville, to assure the success of Sherman's northern expedition. Next slide, please. So the attack was renewed. Butler is replaced by Alfred H. Terry, his first independent command in battle. He commanded the 24th Army Corps. And with the increased expeditionary force, next slide, please, of 9,600 men, there would be 2 brigades of United States colored troops Next slide, please. 2 brigades of U.S. colored troops. So this was not just a white man's fight, African Americans, and these were battle-hardened veterans of fighting in southeastern Virginia, too. Next slide, please. So, when the Federals returned on January the 12th, Bragg had just held a big, giant review in Wilmington for appreciative citizens of Wilmington, and then released his men on R&R to go to downtown Wilmington. And that night, the Federals return, and it is Colonel Lamb at Fort Fisher that alerts headquarters in Wilmington, rather than the other way around, that they're back. And at sunrise, Federal forces go ashore to no opposition whatsoever. And General Whiting had warned, if they come ashore and establish a beachhead, the fall of Fort Fisher and Wilmington are but a matter of time. And now the Federals have come ashore, and Bragg has his troops in Wilmington. Reassembles them, brings them down the river on the afternoon of January the 13th, but too late, the Federals are ashore. Next slide, please. And they await the second largest naval bombardment of the war before they attack the fort later on the afternoon of January the 15th. And by the way, this is the largest combined operation of the Civil War. This was massive. Next slide, please. The ground assault began with the Army attacking the west end of the fort. Next slide, please. A Union naval party would go ashore, volunteers from the various ships in the fleet, to attack the fort as well. The Confederates on the inside, who have been forced underground for the better part of 2.5 days, come out like ants from an anthill to now fight against the onslaught of Union ground forces. And they put up a determined fight, but they're outgunned, outmanned, and overwhelmed and exhausted. And late that night, Federal forces capture Fort Fisher. Next slide, please. General Whiting is severely wounded in the fighting, as is Colonel Lamb. He surrenders late that night and said, "They've got us, boys, but you have done your duty." Unlike Braxton Bragg, who refuses to reinforce the fort and keep it in Confederate hands. Next slide, please. And in fact, he sends word to Richmond. I have the unfortunate news that Fort Fisher has fallen. He was surprised because Fort Fisher had held in that first attack, and now it's in Federal hands. General Lee and Jefferson Davis respond immediately, counterattack, retake the fort. If Wilmington falls, I cannot maintain my army. Bragg declined. Instead, he abandoned the forts at the mouth of the river and withdrew them up to Fort Anderson on the west side of the river and at Sugarloaf on the east to try and prevent the Federals from marching upriver to capture Wilmington. But what good was Wilmington now that blockade runners can't get to the port facilities? Now that the Federals occupy Fort Fisher, any Wilmington-bound blockade runner that enters through Old Inlet can't get further upriver than right here because New Inlet has been closed. But Bragg kept up with his reputation for being, quote, not a fighting general. Next slide, please. And what the Porter does, once he has restocked his ammunition, is he pushes a flotilla of about 30 double-ender gunboats onto the Cape Fear River for a campaign against Wilmington. Next slide, please. And U.S. Grant is so determined now to capture Wilmington that he leaves Petersburg and takes a ship all the way down the coast to hold a war council on board Porter's flagship, the Malvern, to discuss the best way to attack and capture Wilmington. It is so important to final Union military operations. And Porter and General Terry, now having captured the fort and tested the Confederate defenses further upriver, said a three-pronged attack. Up New Hanover County or Federal Point Peninsula, the flotilla to provide covering fire on shore, including an army that would be transferred to the west side to Smithville or Southport for an advance against Fort Anderson. And Grant listened and then said, good. It is the best and only thing to be done. Attack Wilmington by way of Fort Anderson, where we're going to go on our tour this coming October. So be sure to join us. Next slide, please. So this is the beginning of the post-Fort Fisher Wilmington campaign. Next slide, please. So there's going to be a three-pronged attack upriver to Wilmington. They are now 20 miles from where federal forces are entrenched. Next slide, please. Fort Anderson is the largest interior fortification. It's going to be the biggest obstacle, but a more likely target, because on the mainland, the United States Army would have more elbow room to operate rather than on narrow Federal Point, or what we call Pleasure Island today. It wasn't a Pleasure Island to federal forces in those days. So the attack from the riverside, next slide please, would come in mid-February as Union warships, next slide please, would bombard the fort. Now the river channel was narrow and shallow, so the warships had to line up almost single file and fire their bow guns at Fort Fisher. So you don't have a broadside attack like you did at Fort Fisher. So it's important that the Army cooperate very closely with the Navy to be able to capture Fort Anderson. Next slide, please. And they would do that. And how important was the capture of Fort Anderson on February the 19th? Look at that, the New York Herald, the biggest newspaper in the country. It's front page news. Capture of Fort Anderson, just 10 miles up the Cape Fear River from where we are right now. But what was front page news in late February of 1865 became back page news because of subsequent military events. Sherman's successful campaign in the Carolinas, Lee's surrender to Grant, and then the unfortunate and tragic death of Abraham Lincoln. But early on, the capture of Fort Anderson and Wilmington were crucial to final military operations for the Union. Next slide, please. So, Fort Anderson was captured, Sugarloaf was abandoned, Confederate forces are now in full retreat up towards Wilmington, and where's Braxton Bragg? He's returned to Richmond to reorganize his military staff. He's so indifferent to Wilmington's fate that he leaves the city and goes to Richmond on the Wilmington-Weldon Railroad to reorganize his military staff. So Confederates now are in full retreat towards Wilmington in late February. Next slide, please. They'll make one last determined stand at a battle about 3 miles south of Wilmington that I rediscovered in the 1980s and named the Battle of Forks Road. But this would be the Confederates' last stand, and a very important battle because the Union combatants in that battle were United States colored troops. A very important engagement for them. Go there today and look at the Boundless Memorial that's recently been erected there. It's magnificent to honor those young African-American men in blue uniforms who fought so hard to capture Wilmington. Many of them former slaves from the South, including some from Wilmington who fought with the United States colored troops. Next slide, please. So, Wilmington fell on February the 22nd, George Washington's birthday. Federal forces saw that as a good sign. Confederate forces saw that as the last rays of departing hope. One Confederate soldier, a Wilmington native, said, as we trod northward into the interior of the state, having lost Fort Fisher, having lost Wilmington, the streets were darkened. We could see some lights shining from buildings, and those appeared to us to be the last rays of departing hope. And indeed they were. Next slide, please. Blockade running had ended. General Lee's army could no longer be armed and clothed and fed, and as Lee predicted, he had to abandon his position. He attempted to escape from Petersburg, making his way west. Next slide, please. Where on April the 9th, U.S. Grant, next slide, please, ran him down and forced his surrender exactly 46 days after the fall of Wilmington. That's how important Wilmington was to final military operations for the Union. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. I'm sorry for the technical difficulties. I thought the clicker was going to work, but it's not. So, the Wilmington Campaign was absolutely crucial to both sides. the most important city by 1864 to the Confederacy, and arguably the most important city to the Union by late 1864 too. And its capture changed everything. And I appreciate y'all coming tonight to hear that. And that's the short version. I could go. Now, I tried to finish before 8 o'clock so that I can take some questions if y'all have any. What time is it? I did that in record time. Now, do y'all want to start over and do the long version? Okay. Thank y'all very much. Really enjoy being with y'all. Okay.
Take that microphone and then see if you can use this one. So we've got time for a few questions, but I'm going to start the ball rolling.
Wait a minute. Don't everybody leave yet. I got 10 minutes.
There's going to be another drawing. No.
I'm the prize.
Keep your eyes on the prize. Chris, in any of the after-war comments and writings, did they second guess not going after Wilmington earlier? Did the higher-ups say, in hindsight, we made a mistake?
Yep, that's a great question, and my dissertation committee asked me that very question. If Wilmington was so important to the Union, how come they didn't attack it in 1862 or 1863? And in retrospect, they should have. Once they had captured New Bern and Beaufort, New Bern became the base of operations for the United States Army. Beaufort became the station for the way station, substation for the North Atlantic Blockading Squadron. Why didn't they attack Wilmington overland from the north where the defenses were much weaker? Or why didn't the Navy transfer Army troops down the coast to land at Wrightsville Beach and attack Wilmington from the east? And in fact, David Porter wrote in his post-war memoir, had the Union captured Wilmington in 62 or 63, as was proposed on a number of occasions, the war would have ended at least a year earlier and saved hundreds of thousands of lives. The short answer to that is politics. They wanted to capture Charleston. They were absolutely determined to capture Charleston, and Charleston withstood the longest siege of the Civil War, 587 days, and did not fall. And so Wilmington became increasingly important, and yes, the Federals should have gone after it much, much earlier. And by the time they did, it was a much tougher nut to crack.
Questions. Here we go.
Oh, yeah.
And by the way, if you don't know it, we've probably got 100 people watching this presentation on Zoom. And I'm going to ask Carter, do we have any questions from the Zoom people? Not tonight, but there's 100 other folks tuning into this.
Where did Grant meet with Porter and, I guess, was it Whitesville then?
He met with Admiral Porter and General Terry, who, by the way, his first independent victory of the Civil War was the capture of Fort Fisher. He's most famous for being the commander of the Department of the Dakotas in 1876 when George Custer's command was wiped out at the Battle of Little Bighorn. He was Custer's commander. But his first independent victory was Fort Fisher. They met on the Cape Fear River on board the USS Malvern, which was Porter's flagship, which was anchored about where Battery Lamb was, or what is today the south wharf of Sunny Point. So about 8 miles upriver from where we are. And Grant brought General John McAllister Schofield with him, and then brought Schofield's one division of his corps down to reinforce General Terry's army that had been badly bloodied at Fort Fisher for the push on Wilmington. And when they arrived in early February, that's when they began the advance.